First of all, I would like to thank Cosmin Costinage for the invitation and the wonderful stuff at Parasite that received us all so well and are taking care that we are well fed and being very comfortable. So Jeannie, Ada, James, Trevor, Oscar, etc. It's really nice being here. Thank you very much. And also thanks to the Asian Society for hosting the whole event and technicians, etc., helping us setting up everything. So it's quite a challenge, I find, to be the first one to talk about determinisms in art vocabularies. And I will do it by changing a bit the focus. Instead of determinisms in art vocabularies and interaction between art and politics and specific historical conditions, I would like to speak about determinisms and, or rather, determination and aesthetics. So I will give you here two case studies of two projects I've been working on. One was the project that Cosmin mentioned, Principio Potosí, which was an exhibition and publication project I did together with the artists, curators, and writers couple Alice Kreischer and Andreas Siegmann, which are very dear friends, and we worked on this from 2008 to 2011. And the other project is rather a work in progress I'm involved with, and that has to do with what I call the Pharmacologies of Enlightenment, and which is not by any means finished, and it's rather that I hope I can finance the research for the next years. So I will sketch you a bit the connection between these both, because that has to do with determination and aesthetics. Just very briefly, if we talk about determination, obviously we have to see what are we talking about. It's a word that I think, if we assume the hegemonic status of French philosophy in the art discourse, we can say that determination is a word or a notion that has been pretty much linked to Louis Althusser, and through him has been a critique on several of his students, including Bourdieu, Foucault. And Althusser himself actually tried to avoid the idea or the notion of determination in favor of what he called overdetermination. And overdetermination, a term he borrowed from Freudian psychoanalysis, refers to a way more complex kind of arrangement that produces effect, like a structure that produces a complex structure that produces an effect and expresses or becomes the articulation of its agents. So the term of overdetermination can be seen as a kind of correlate to, in post-structuralism, always been regarded very important, which is the sign theory and semiotics, etc. And the term of overdetermination from the Althusserian side should be regarded as something like the political or so multiplicity of events that coming together produce an effect. And these two, I think, we should regard as the necessary theoretical or epistemological background to understand what could be regarded as determinism. It's, as Althusser would say, a system or a structure in dominance. So, as Althusser told us, just to finish this quickly, there is no such thing as determination we could grasp in its purity. This would never occur, not even in the Russian Revolution, the example he takes from Lenin's writings. So determinism or determination is impossible to be grasped in its purity. It's always impure, it's always multiple, heterogeneous, it's overdetermined, and the only case to grasp it in a only determination way or in its purity would be to reveal simultaneously an ideological blind spot on which this is built on. So I will try to give you two case studies which will be less theoretic and less French, and tell you about these two projects. About the Potosí principle, which is, I believe, the reason why I was invited mainly, because it has to do a lot with the title. I could talk for hours and days. It was a very long project, and I would like to ask you to stop me, especially Cosmin, if I'm taking too much time. So, right, the first of the two case studies, the show Principio Potosí, that was shown in Reina Sofia in Madrid. It was shown at Haus der Kultur in der Welt in Berlin. And it was shown, that's all in the year 2010, in the year 2011 in Museo Nacional de Arte La Paz and Museo de Etnografía y Folklore at the same time. Also, I have to say, obviously, I'm going to focus a bit, like shift a bit the kind of attention from the axis of Asia and Europe and move towards the Latin American context. Both examples I will talk about will have to do with the Latin American context. Once the Andes, as colonial Andes, will be talking here between the 16th and 18th century. And the second example will have to do with the Caribbean and Brazil, rather. And both these examples will help, just to link it to what Hamad was saying before, to experience or to grasp from one side the analysis of the colonized and from the other of the colonizers, to play on these two registers simultaneously. Okay, so Principio Potosí. This is the catalog cover. Potosí was a famous silver city discovered in the silver was discovered in the 16th century, in 1545, by the Spanish colonizers, and it became soon, since there was a whole mountain full of silver, it became one of the richest and most important economic centers of colonial Spain. We're talking about the colonial empire at that moment that basically stretches all over the world. For us, it was interesting to focus on a particular time frame in which new forms of politics were developed, which would be a paradigm shift in a Foucauldian sense from the punishing colonial, the murderous punishing massacre regime of early colonialism towards a biopolitical oriented regime of making life productive. This shift can be, I think, placed in a time of the change from Charles I of Spain, which is Charles V of Habsburg rule, to his son Philip II. At this time, I want to later focus on the years between 1571 and 1581, and these 10 years Philip II installed what we could call the basis of a modern state of biopolitical rule. So at that moment, we asked ourselves, the Baroque painting that was created in this boomtown of the 16th century, like the boomtown of 16th and 17th century on a global scale, how can we grasp the image production? And we brought about 20 colonial paintings that were made between the 16th and the 18th century in Potosí, which is located in today's Bolivian Andes. We brought them to Madrid, later to Berlin, and then back to La Paz. And we included them in an exhibition and worked with international artists from contemporary boomtowns or booming economic contexts. So we had artists from Beijing, from Moscow, from London. We had artists working on Dubai. And we had a lot more international artists, which would have a kind of answer-response relation to the colonial paintings. So we tried to develop a network of dialogue between the historic moment of Potosí and its modes of exploitation, as I said, biopolitical modes of governance, which I will just talk about next, and the image production. So the question was, in how far is art servant of the ideological war that was being fought at that time twice, like in a double sense. It was fought as a missionary enterprise, the colonial painting, the Christian painting, and it was fought in the sense that the counter-revolution, the counter-reformation, I say, the counter-reformation was fighting against the Reformation in Europe. So Luther was up, and Protestant aesthetics came up, and the Catholic Church inaugurated the Council of Trent in the same year that silver was discovered in Potosi, and developed a whole kind of warfare of the images against Protestant aesthetics of communication. So there was this double warfare going on the symbolic level, and these kind of paintings interested us a lot. How can we grasp them within the broader context and extended economy? Yes, so in this sense, we wanted to ask people from these new booming contexts to simply reflect on their situation, taken as a starting point the images. I will show you around the exhibition a bit. It was developed in following certain ideas or notions or questions or phrases. We had 4 chapters. The first one is about primitive accumulation, the notion Karl Marx called the so-called primitive accumulation in the first volume of Capital. And we ask ourselves if this is actually possible and where is it to be located. Karl Marx talks about the English example, just to give an example of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and he calls this the primitive accumulation and analyzes it. And well, we thought that in Potosi something very similar was happening. And we asked ourselves, is this not happening more or less in similar ways? Is there not a principle at stake, which we later obviously called the Potosi principle, that is being repeated throughout space and time and history and reterritorialized in different contexts? So this first chapter is trying to figure out these spots. The second chapter is about human rights, the function human rights can have, like the functionality of human rights for systems of governance. The third chapter has the enigmatic title, How can we sing the alien song in the land of the Lord? And it's asked the question about how is a hegemony being produced, also through culture and production images. And the last chapter is called The World Upside Down, which deals with the possibility of insurgency or revolt, subversion, however. So we had these different chapters arranged as paths through the exhibition. Wait, I think I have a pointer, yeah. So this is the space, and you had a guide, and you could walk around with a map and had information, different numbers, and assigned to different artworks, and you had information in the booklet. You could walk around the exhibition, see the artworks, follow the paths, and the different paths were superposed. So you had on the floor the signs, right, to the, I think I did something wrong. Oh no, here. You have different icons that are related to different chapters, and then you have the chapters, you have the icons, and you walk around and find them on the floor, and it's a sophisticated sign system and reference system developed by Andreas Sigman. So you could encounter several artworks several times during the exhibition following different paths. So it was a complex structure of superimposition, because all the different mechanisms that we were interested in, like human rights for governance, etc., I'll be talking about this, are all interconnected. So you would follow the paths, for example, the first chapter, and you would move around the space. Here you have the ground floor plan of the Berlin space at Haus der Kultur in der Welt, and you can probably see better here how you were instructed to move around following a certain narration that explained in our logic how one could understand this, what we call the Potosi principle. This is the entrance to the Madrid installation. And what you see here right when you get in is the Museum of Migrant Workers, the Museum of Culture and Arts of Migrant Workers from Beijing, which you can see here as well, set in the middle. And well, then you continue. Here you have, as number 7, you had the work of Harun Farocki, Viennese artist Ines Dujak. In between you had colonial paintings, the Argentinian artist Eduardo Molinari. Here again, about soy plantations. Just to give you an impression what the space looked like, I'm going to talk about Argentinian artist Sonia Abian. what was important for us was showing this multifaceted construction of the relation of image production and biopolitical structures of governance and economic background in a macropolitical sense, which is colonial economy. You had different levels and different levels on different levels. You had kind of planes in a horizontal organization and in a vertical organization. You had different levels. You could go up, go down, and you had different levels of visibility superimposed. This is a Bolivian artist, Elvira Espejo, Dutch artist, Matthijs de Braune. Well, one of these perspectives, you could have as many in the exhibition where things would just like clash together and come together. The Bolivian anarchist feminist collective Mujeres Creando. The Chinese artist Zhao Liang. You have the Russian group Studielat. Well, again, Baroque. So this was a bit to give you an impression, the division of the space, the organization of the space. This is Leon Ferrari, also Argentinian. And you had all these informations and kind of optical devices to see, like you have here, I don't know the word in English to see in the further away, you see this? Binoculars and, well, other glasses. So, however, this was the way everything was organized. It was a constant shifting between being close, being distant, being involved, not being involved, etc. Just to know what we're talking about in terms of formal organization of space. The organization of space will be something we'll be talking in the second of my examples more intensively. Now I wanted to present to you the aspect of the determinism or determination or over-determination, as I like to put it. So in Potosi, the production of images was obviously shaped heavily by the structures that were at stake and that organized political, economic life. And I want to sketch out now certain reforms that Philip II installed after he took over from his father Charles V, or Charles I of Spain, and which marked this paradigm shift from the punishing colonial rule to the liberating, if you like, biopolitical rule of a proto-modern state. So at that moment, the Spanish, in 1571, we're talking, Potosi is booming. Only 30 years later, Potosi will be as big as London and Paris, and would have as much importance on the economic field. So we're talking about a huge global spot, like a spot of global weight and importance. And this was part of it was basically the center of the colonial economy of Spain at that moment. In Spain, the Spanish Empire went from Mexico to Buenos Aires, Potosi, Manila, Spain, of course, the Netherlands, Austria, Hungary. That all was the huge Spanish Empire at that moment under Philip II. So it was a global enterprise, as was their logotypical representation and so on. Silver was the main important raw material for the Spanish economy. And as we heard, it was extracted from this mountain, which is the famous Cerro Rico, which is the rich mountain, in translation, of Potosi. Potosi is situated on 4,000 meters altitude, more or less, over the sea level. And this is a painting from the 17th century, which was repainted in the 18th century by one of the famous colonial paintings of Bolivian art history, or the history of Bolivian art. He's called Gaspar Miguel de Rios, Berrio. And what we can see, like unfortunately not here, but in the film of Harun Farocki, which we saw some images, is that he had portrayed meticulously every yard in every house and what was going on there, like who was doing what in which yard and how this social was organized and divided and where were the rich and what did they wear and everything, like meticulously in miniatures. It's a very impressive painting. The painting has more or less this size in original. And what Harun did was to go with the camera and use a microscopic lens and filming it and giving us big representations of these small, tiny details which portrayed social life, explaining to the visitor of the exhibition the economic production, which is the macroeconomic, if you like, condition, labor rights in that sense. How did the mining worker contribute to macro growth of the Spanish economy by going into the mine and bringing out the silver? This is the story that Harun Farocki tells us. What is interesting to me now is how this is connected to a set of reforms that Philip II implanted, and which have to do with basically four aspects I would like to mention here. First is the labor rights connected to human rights and connected to reforms in the sector of public health and connected to education and arts. 71 is also the year, just to make a connection here in the global context, in which Manila is installed as capital of the new Spanish resort, 1571. So we're talking about rules because they are dictated from Madrid, from the center of this universe, to all the margins. So we're talking about a rule that is indeed global. And the first of these reforms concerning labor rights is the so-called law of the Mita. The Mita was imposed to design the indigenous population of the Andes, the Quechua, Aymara, and Uru populations to become workers for the crown. So if before what Charles V was doing was to kill the non-believers in order to punish them and to educate them and to missionate them, convert them into Christians, what Philip II understood was that this was not necessary by any means. The only really important thing, most of all, is that they could work properly. So don't kill them, don't harm them too much because they still have to work. You need their bodies. The Spanish crown was totally broke at that moment, and there were these reforms Philip II installed were meant to bring prosperity to the Spanish economy. So first of all, they need to recuperate labor force. Labor force they recuperated by designing a law, the Mita law, that said that every seventh male of every population had to go to the mines every 7th year for 1 year and work there to pay the tribute to the crown, which would make him become a sort of resident, official resident. So the indigenous populations, as I said, Aymara, Quechua, and Uru, were designated to tribute labor, achieving the status of humans. This was the interaction, basically, with the, proposed by the Spanish government. So you would make the laborer a human by letting him pay with his labor force. And next to it, there was a diet. They had to eat a certain amount of coca leaves. This amount of coca leaves is interesting also to tell. It has to do with the whole situation of human rights. So coca leaves, as you all know, is the leaf famous for being the primary source for what later in the 19th century a German chemist extracted as cocaine, which is the active alkaloid inside the leaf. Well, if you chew the coca leaf, which is a cultural practice for thousands and thousands of years in the Andes, in all Andean populations, you gain energy. But you don't only gain energy in terms of you're more awake, or feel yourself more powerful, but you also lose hunger and pain. So it's a very effective painkiller, very effective against hunger. It's good nutrition. It has a lot of minerals, calcium, etc., and it energizes you. So Philip II now understood that if his father was prohibiting the coca leaf, for example, in order, because it was a heretic spice, and it was prohibited, and the Inquisition was there to punish everyone who was eating the coca leaf. So Philip II understood he has to make them eat the coca leaf instead of prohibiting it. That had the effect that they could work longer. They could do working periods for the meter of 48 hours without breaks, basically, without getting food and so on. So people had to eat coca leaves, but they didn't only had to eat coca leaves, they also had to buy coca leaves. And the interesting thing about it now is a double, very fascinating, like in its cruelty, fascinating double circuit of exploitation which sets in, which is if before the Inquisition was there to punish and persecute people who ate coca leaves, now the Inquisition was there to persecute the people who didn't pay tax on the exchange of coca leaves. So the selling of coca leaves became a tax issue, and the Spanish crown gained or got a certain amount, a percentage, because of the tax laws they had imposed. So every mitayo, every indigenous worker who had to pay tribute to the crown in order to be regarded as human had to eat coca to be able to actually work in 4,000 meters in the mines. And in order to get what they needed to survive that work, they needed to pay again to the crown the taxes. So they paid double doing the same work. Did I explain myself? It's kind of tricky. So this is fascinating. You can see that only with the coca leaves you could actually deal with this work, because there were many attempts by different other colonial empires to bring slaves from Africa or from Asia to work in the mines, and nobody could really deal with the situation of 4,000 meters altitude. The oxygen is very bad. So only basically the local who had this knowledge and this training of eating coca leaves and knowing with what ashes of which other plants to mix the coca leaf could survive this kind of work. So interesting enough, the human rights situation, again, was not random. It was not an idea of an enlightened emperor to give his workers the status of humans. The status of humans prevented them to be caught as slaves by other colonial empires and entrepreneurs from other places. So the people who actually worked or invested in the silver mines were not Spanish. They were basically English, German, Danish, Dutch, etc. And they rented the labor force from the workers from the Spanish crown. They rented the grounds, the mines from the crown. And, well, whatever they needed to produce or to extract the silver, they rented from the Spanish. So the Spanish economy was basically based on the rental of all these means of production. And labor force and the bodies of the indigenous population was part of it. So by making them human, the Spanish crown was preventing that the English, for example, just take them and say, you know, they're my slaves. Also interesting. So these were different kind of rules that were 15 minutes. Okay, I'm almost through. So the next thing to understand in this extended economy then is the production of knowledge. In 1573, the same year, in 1571, the meter was imposed and the human rights laws were imposed in 1573. In 1571, Philip II monopolized all the production of books, books of prayer and of emblems to be sent to the colonies, to be reproduced as paintings in the churches, to one printing house, which was the Plantin-Moretus Press in Antwerp, which at that moment was the biggest, most effective press, or said to be, in Europe. So they produced for the whole global empire. You could today think of it as a big internet server or something. These kind of images that were the ones that were thought to mission the people in the indigenous populations in the different parts of the world, were reproduced in all canvases, etc., and were brought to the most remote places. For example, a small city called Caquiaviri in the department of La Paz in Bolivia, which is also on this high plateau of 4,000 meters altitude above sea level, and from which a significant part of the workers of the mines of Potosí were recruited. Caquiaviri was a point of gathering of mitayos from all kinds of smaller communities, and they were from there then kind of deported to Potosí. Here, this kind of missionary work had to take place. So you had in these churches, in the church of Caquiaviri, you have the so-called postrimerias, which is a cycle to indoctrinate the individuals. And here you see a small fragment, which, as you can see, operates with fear. Fear is very effective, as we know, to put people under pressure in a kind of psychological way. This detail I chose because the coins that this person is puking out have the weapon on them. You probably cannot see them, but they have the weapon of the Potosí printing house, of the coin printing house on them. So there's direct relations to the silver economy of Potosí, and well, you have all kinds of very cruel imagery related to colonial organization of society, etc. Yes, I just took this one because it shows also kind of different health situations of the vicious and the virtuous. And Philip II also imposed in 1581 health laws that monopolized the services of the health sector onto, again, state kind of centralized general hospitals. And this law was passed in 1581. It took a while till it was solidified everywhere, but it started under Philip II. And what it did was also impose taxes on health services. So the state went over to not only monopolize, but also to control all kinds of health services. What was not controlled by the state became illicit practices. So this is the kind of sector of reproduction that was well defined by the reform laws of Philip II, and it creates what we can, as I said, understand as a sector of reproduction, of societal reproduction, and there the production of imagery is only one part of an extended economy. This extended economy is important to understand, because I think that we're talking all the time about art, and we say what is contemporary art, but by regarding art as such, and a complementary perspective on it would be, and this probably has most to do with determinism or determination or over-determination, that we could think of not attribute art or the question about art to art as an object, like objectifying it, but related to the problematic of the subject. I believe before we were talking about what makes visuality visual or visible. And these kind of mechanisms indeed have to do not so much with art as object or as something reified or displayed, but much more the problem of the subject and the construction of this subjectivity. So in the terms of ideology and ideology theory, to come back to Louis Althusser, we see that art as an ideological tool for governance placed together with a vast catalog of different kind of fields and segments of social production and reproduction, which I would say would be important to take into account, like necessarily to understand how art relates to us, in the sense that it produces also our perception and is not only read by us. So I have this sentence you can read here, which is a Bolivian art historian. She was talking about the importance of art for general production in the minds. Take your time, read it. I'll have some water. So what is at stake? I hope you went through. It basically speaks about the importance of circulation and what is important for me now, the articulation of a kind of participation of art in a kind of semiotic exchange that again is articulated to the economic exchange and production of kind of hard currencies and labor relations. So this art obviously has been mediated. It's not only that we are kind of produced by art of our perception. This whole mediation of art is important if we take into account that today also what every art which is contemporary has in common is that they're all represented being in awful white spaces, which me personally, I cannot understand why everyone is talking so much about critical approaches and everyone morphs their art again into white rectangular spaces. I'm going to show you some other white rectangular spaces that had to do with the colonial rule. If we understand now that the colonial project of the Spanish Empire was a global one, we can also understand that the same kind of churches with same patterns that were imported from Madrid were built in Manila, as in Mexico, as on Cuba, as in Potosí, as in Buenos Aires. And these kind of constructions were all basically the same in terms of engineering. And this engineering, I'll get there. So I guess we won't come to the next part probably. We can discuss this later. So however, now the sensible is what is interesting here if we want to think about how segments that compose our social reality are articulated. And the sensible is part divided into sensorium. Now our faculty of the senses is part of the segmentation and placed into different machinic procedures that produce our perception and our interaction and the transformation, articulation of semiotic exchange to, let's say, real or hard production. Our senses also were, in the Latin American context, pretty much organized by these spaces that were all homogeneous, but all the populations which had to go now and were indoctrinated in these spaces had totally different kind of buildings of their homes. Of course, it's not necessary to say that in Buenos Aires, the people in the Pampa would live totally different than they would live in the Caribbean or they would live in the high plateaus of the Andes. So now everyone had rectangular organization of space and an imagery that was imported and determined by the rule. This is just a mining district in Potosí, by the rule of the Spanish Empire. Now, I will cut the second project. Perhaps we can talk about it later or so. The important thing now to end this is to understand that there's always the chance, or there was always a kind of also resistance to these kind of determinations or production of perception and so on. And one, for example, consisted in the particular way of non-illusional space dealing with flat surfaces in painting. So what was not copied by several indigenous painters and painting houses and workshops was that they would not reproduce the patterns of creating perspective and illusion of depth in the pictorial space. So, for example, here the workshop of the indigenous painter Luis Niño in Potosí is very famous for being absolutely flat. And this flatness was a way of insurgence by the own painters that were obviously paid or not paid by the church, etc., by the Spanish entrepreneurs or the state, that is the local government. And the production of a flat surface was a way that the art historian, most famous Bolivian art historian Teresa Gisbert, analyzed as a way to block this kind of ideological articulation of the gaze and the perception with the illusion of space and integrating the kind of ideological entity that reproduces the production. we have some famous Bolivian paintings that all deal with this kind of flatness in a more or less obvious way. I just wanted to talk about this sensible things. Now the problem is I have to end now here because we have. I wanted to switch now the perspective on the construction of the colonizer. We're talking about the colonized subjects, and I wanted to talk about the construction of the colonizer, which I find is very interesting, which, well, I guess we have to leave it for tomorrow during the plenary session. In 5 minutes. So what we have is also not only tomorrow the organization of space in terms of like no illusion, but also obviously a semiotic, iconic subversion of using the icons as like St. James, the Moor slayer, as the Indio slayer, or as the slayer of Spaniards, which is my favorite, and. Here we have one last example, and I finish with that, which is the St. James slaying of Chinese, which was also one expression of, it's a Bolivian painting of the ambition of global expansion, present, like the conquest of the Asian market was very present in the Bolivian Andes. So to finish with that, thank you, and excuse me for being so unorganized in time.
Hi, thank you, Max, for the delightful presentation. We're just going to make it really short with 2 questions from the floor. One over there.
No, I'm sorry to monopolize one of the only 2 options, but I really wanted to say this because you ended with this, and I'm happy that you ended with this comment of like how the colonial project of the Spanish Empire had the conquest of Asia and of China in particular as a very important part of you know, its constitutive mission, because this is true, and this actually, you know, counteracts what you said earlier, that, you know, we're moving away now from a nation context. That's completely untrue, because the relevancy for the Chinese context of Potosi is, well, twofold. One is because of the principle that you described, that indeed is a recurrent principle and it's, you know, could very well be what defines the premise of our session in this conference, a particular relationship between modes of production, between a society that is organized by those modes of production and a visual realm and principles of expressing power and hierarchies in visual forms. But then second is a more prosaic historical one, because the actual discovery of those large quantities of silver and the introduction of that silver on the world market had a huge impact on the economy and history of China, of Ming China, and then of Qing China. This is something that I think Principio Potosi didn't actually discuss enough. I think this could have been like or can be like a second part of it. But I think this is really looking at the modern history of China from an economic perspective. This single introduction of silver on the world market, and then consequently in the trade with China, is what created the future imbalances that led the Brits to, you know, get the opium to counterbalance it. So that's where it all starts.
The silver was very valuable for the Spanish because it allowed actually an exchange currency with the Asian economies. That was the silver. In that sense, it's very important, yeah. Another comment?
So just to add, it was not just the exchange with China or with Asian countries. It was actually the exchange within Europe. So this is what equipped Spain to trade with the Brits. And it was that which created the opium imbalance. And in a way, there was a phrase where China is where silver goes to die. That all of the silver that was coming out of Potosi was then going to China and staying there. And it was to try and get it back into circulation that the Brits had to invent something to sell to the Chinese.
I think this is, for the plenary session tomorrow.
Yeah, we can.
Actually, just one thing to add on to that about the silver,
sure.
very quick.
Okay.
Arguably, Spain, up until recently, has financially lived off the silver from Potosi. It's what has kept its economy going because of the amount of money that was in the aristocratic families in Spain and within the Spanish economy.
I didn't get the question part. What?
It's just making a comment on how.
No, it's kind of the microphone fell off, unfortunately. Yeah, Cosmin, did you hear it? Can you say what it was? It was acoustically.
It's not a question.
It's not a question. Oh, yeah, yes. All right, excuse me.
Just one of the artists in Principio Potosi started a work, Ines Dujak started a work that she continued to do, and the last iteration about a month ago is actually about the Chinese who've now in that area bought mountains, that they're taking away the whole mountains because of rare earths. So they've bought them, and it's like a reiteration of that story. The villagers are actually thrown out.
It was very interesting. Thanks for that comment. That particularly the Chinese contributions and the Russians were absolutely convinced about this principle being at stake, reiterated, being repeated over and over, and they experiencing exactly these processes of primitive accumulation today. Yeah. So what I just wanted to say is that probably it would have become more clear, but what I'm interested in is this kind of inversion of not making it the determinism, not an issue of literal effect of a structure, but also to see that it's a very complex arrangement that is taking place, which we may regard today also in respect of contemporary art, which would probably help us to understand what we're facing nowadays.
On that note.